So another clear dichotomy that is presented between qualitative and quantitative research is whether or not it is focused upon the particulars of an individual or a context or situation or their interaction, or whether it is interested in generalisable findings. Now, we talked about this briefly when we covered descriptive research last week and the descriptive kinds of research question that you can answer. We can ask questions that relate to the description of a particular individual or event, or we can ask questions about whether or not the description of a particular sample from a broader population is representative of them, and therefore the description that we have is generalisable. And this doesn't just apply to descriptive research, of course, it can apply to explanatory research. But typically, qualitative research and quantitative research are dichotomized in this sort of fashion as well. But strictly speaking, again, this is not a true dichotomy. It's perfectly acceptable to take either methodology and either look at particulars or look at something at trying to draw generalisable inferences. So let's take, for example, the idea that within the generalisable setting, most quantitative research falls under what would be considered to be a kind of statistical or probabilistic type of generalisability. So as I've mentioned before, typically in research, we take a sample of individuals from a broader population that we want to draw inferences about. Now, when I use the term population here, I don't necessarily mean just individual, say, people or entities, but normally that's what we're talking about. But we could also be talking about the situation where we have, say, a single individual and we want to look at repeated situations that they find themselves in, although we can't look at every single situation of the kind we're interested in, and we may take a sample of those situations and draw an inference about perhaps how they behave or react in a particular situation. But either way, we're always taking a sample for various logistic reasons, typically, that we then use to draw an inference from. Now, there's no reason why we have to limit ourselves to looking at quantitative data to do that. Typically speaking, though, that is the case because quantitative data is often easier to capture, whereas in qualitative research, it's often more laborious. You get larger kind of data sets to work through, and so typically speaking, say you're conducting interviews or something like that, you're more likely to have a smaller sample, which may raise questions about the generalisability of it. But all this really highlights is the logistic difficulties between the different methods and using them for generalisability. There's no reason why, for example, we couldn't conduct a large survey study where we took as many students across the university as possible in a random fashion. Say we collected 50% of all the students at Solent University, got them to complete a survey about how they felt about university life, and then we used that as a sample to draw a generalisable inference about what Solent University students think about life at university. There's no reason why we couldn't also conduct semi-structured interviews with these individuals or conduct focus groups and capture qualitative data about their thoughts, feelings, experiences, and so on and so forth, and draw generalisable inferences from them. Now, of course, the latter would be quite hard to do, but there's nothing inherently stopping us from doing that and utilising that kind of statistical probabilistic approach to generalisability. In the same regard, there's no reason why, whereas although qualitative research typically focuses on, say, the individuals that are taking part in it or the context that they're interested in, there's no reason why we can't do the same with quantitative data as well. We could capture very, very specific quantitative data and do a case study of an individual. So, I gave the example before that, we could look at, for example, Usain Bolt breaking the 100-meter record. That is a particularising case that we're interested in. We can describe and try to explain that and not consider it as being in any way generalisable, but just looking at that particular individual taking part in that particular event. So there's no reason why, again, qualitative or quantitative research has any particular monopoly on particularising accounts of phenomena or generalisable inferences regarding phenomena. Now, one thing I will note, and this again highlights the importance of recognising the ontological and epistemological assumptions that accompany the way in which people go about doing their research. Typically speaking, qualitative researchers often fall under the more constructivist type of approach. And within that, they would consider it to be kind of almost incommensurable with their ontology and epistemology to consider statistical probabilistic generalizability. And so this is why they often focus on these kind of particularizing accounts of things. On the other hand, those who are more positivist or fall on the critical realist line are more than comfortable with the idea of using statistical probabilistic kinds of generalizability, drawing from samples inferences about the populations from which they came. Particularly in the critical realist case, they even go so far as saying that the empirical observations that we make can be generalizable or used to draw generalizable inferences to the underlying causal factors and mechanisms that give rise to those observations that we make. But again, there's no reason why, just because of those different philosophical stances that are taken, that, for example, constructivist qualitative researchers can't consider types of generalizability as well. So there's a great paper I'm going to include in the suggested readings list by a friend and colleague of mine, Brett Smith, who's a professor at Durham University, who has written about the types of generalizability that fit within the more traditional qualitative research perspective that falls under that more constructivist type of philosophical stance. So I suggest you definitely go in and have a read about that if you want to learn more about how generalizability can be applied to qualitative research. But generally speaking, as I said, it's not as clear-cut as there being a strict dichotomy between particulars and generalization when it comes to qualitative and quantitative research.